did that. Blandford, no. Nope. If you are done listening to me read The Last Castle to you, you are more than welcome to work on the stuff that you need to work on. For everybody else that's going to stay and listen to me, let me grab my book. Where did I put my book? Oh, there it is. All right, so I am, and remember guys, the book is in the classroom, so the PDF is linked in the classroom if you want to go ahead and open that up. In class studio audience, do you have any questions for me? Are you okay? Good? 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 Okay. All right, so I'm on page, for me, it's page 245. The section begins with, "It was dusk when I got my first glimpse of it off in the distance." Okay? Good? Okay. And remember, at this point, she's at New York City, right? She's moved to New York. "It was dusk when I got my first glimpse of it off in the distance beyond a ridge. All I could see were the spires and blocky tops of the buildings. And then when we reached the crest of the ridge, and there across the wide river was a huge island jammed tip to tip with skyscrapers, their glass glowing like fire in the setting sun. My heart started to race and my palms grew damp, and I walked down the bus aisle to the tiny restroom in the rear and washed up in the metal basin. I studied my face in the mirror and wondered what New Yorkers would think when they looked at me. Would they see an Appalachian hick? A tall, gawky girl, still all elbows and knees and jutting teeth? For years, Dad had been telling me I had an inner beauty. Most people didn't see it. I had trouble seeing it myself. But Dad said Dad was always saying he could damn well see it, and that was what mattered. I hoped when New Yorkers looked at me, they would see whatever it was that my dad saw. When the bus pulled into the terminal, I collected my suitcase and walked to the middle of the station. A blur of hurrying bodies streamed past me, leaving me feeling like a stone in a creek, and then I heard someone calling my name. He was a pale guy with the thick black frame glasses that made his eyes look tiny. His name was Evan, and he was a friend of Lori's. She was at work and had asked him to come and meet me. Evan offered to carry my suitcase and led me out to the street, a noisy place with crowds backed up waiting to cross the intersection, cars jammed together, and papers blowing every which way. I followed him right into the thick of it. After one block, Evan put down my suitcase. "This is heavy," he said. "What do you have in here?" "My coal collection." He looked at me blankly. "I'm just kidding you," I said, and punched him in the shoulder. Evan wasn't quick on the uptake, but I took it as a good sign. There was no reason for me to be automatically in awe of the wit and intellect of the New Yorkers. I picked up the suitcase. Evan did not insist I give it back to him, and in fact, he seemed sort of relieved that I was carrying it. We continued on the way down the block, and he kept glancing at me sideways. "You West Virginia girls are one tough breed," he said. "You got that right," I told him. Evan dropped me off at the German restaurant called Zum Zum. Lori was behind the counter carrying 4 beer steins in each hand, her hair in twin buns, and speaking in a thick German accent because, she explained later, it increased tips. "This is mein sister," she called out to the men at one of her tables. They raised their beer steins and shouted, "Welcome to New Yorken." I didn't know any German, so I said grazie. They all got a chuckle out of that. Lori was in the middle of her shift, so I went out to wander the streets. I got lost a couple of times and had to ask directions. People had been warning me for months about how rude New Yorkers were. It was true, I learned that night, that if you tried to stop them on the street, a lot of them kept walking, shaking their heads. Those who did stop didn't look at you first. They gazed off down the block, their faces closed. But as soon as they realized you weren't trying to hustle them or panhandle money, they warmed right up. They looked you in the eye, gave you detailed instructions about how to get to the Empire State Building. You went up 9 blocks and made a right, and it cut across 2 blocks and so on. They even drew you maps. New Yorkers, I figured, just pretended to be unfriendly. Later, Lori and I took a subway down to Greenwich Village and walked over to the Evangeline, a woman's hostel where she had been living. That first night, I woke up at 3 a.m. and saw the sky all lit up in bright orange. I wondered if there was a big fire somewhere, but in the morning, Lori told me that the orange glow came from the air pollution reflecting light off the streets and buildings. "The night sky here," she said, "always has that color. what it meant to New York, you could never see in the stars, but Venus wasn't a star, and I wondered if I'd be able to see it. The very next day, I landed a job at a hamburger joint on 14th Street. After taxes and Social Security, I'd be taking home over $80 a week. I had spent a lot of time imagining what New York would be like, but the one thing that had never occurred to me was the opportunities would come so easily. Aside from having to wear those embarrassing red and yellow uniforms with matchy floppy hats, I loved the job. The lunch and dinner rushes were always exciting, and the lines backing up around the counter, the cashiers shouting orders in their microphones, the grill guys shoveling hamburgers through broiling conveyor belt, everyone running around and fixing the counter to the drink station, to the infrared fries warmer, staying on top of the orders, the manager jumping in to help whenever crisis cropped up. We got 20% off our meals, and the first few weeks there, I had a cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake every day for lunch. In the middle of summer, Lori found us an apartment in a neighborhood we could afford, the South Bronx. The yellow Art Deco building must have been pretty fancy when it was opened, but now graffiti covered the outside walls, and the cracked mirrors and the lobby were held together with duct tape. Still, it was what Mom called good bones. Our apartment was bigger than the entire house on Little Hobart Street, and way fancier. It had shiny oak parquet floors, a foyer with 2 steps leading down into the living room where I slept, and off to the side a bedroom that became Lori's. We also had a kitchen with a working refrigerator and a gas stove that had a pilot light so you didn't need matches to get it going. You just turned the dial listening to the clicking, then watched the circle of blue flame flare up through the tiny holes in the burner. My favorite room was the bathroom. It had a black and white tile floor, a toilet that actually flushed with a powerful whoosh, and a tub so deep you could submerge yourself completely in it, and hot water that never ran out. It didn't bother me that the apartment was in a rough neighborhood. We always lived in a rough neighborhood. Puerto Rican kids hung out on the block at all hours, playing music, dancing, sitting on abandoned cars, clustering at the entrance of the elevated subway station and in front of the bodega that sold single cigarettes called Lucy's. I got jumped a number of times. People were always telling me that if I was robbed, I should hand over the money rather than being killed. But I was darned if I was going to give some stranger my hard-earned cash, and I didn't want to become known as in the neighborhood as an easy target, so I always fought back. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. What worked best was to keep my wits about me. Once, as I was getting on the train, some guy tried to grab my purse, but I jerked it back, and the strap broke. He fell empty-handed to the platform floor as the train pulled out. I looked through the window and gave him a big, sarcastic wave. That fall, Lori helped me find a public school where instead of going to the classes, the students signed up for internships all over the city. One of my internships was at the Phoenix, a weekly newspaper run out of a dingy storefront on the Atlantic Avenue in downtown Brooklyn, near the old Ex-Lax factory. The owner, publisher, and editor-in-chief was Mike Armstrong. He saw himself as a muckraking gadfly and had mortgaged his brownstone 5 times to keep the Phoenix going. The staff all used Underwood manual typewriters with threadbare ribbons and yellowed keys. The E on mine was broken, so I used the at in its place. We never had a copy paper and instead wrote on discarded press releases that we dug out of the trash. At least once a month, someone's paycheck bounced. Reporters were always quitting in disgust. In the spring, when Mr. Armstrong was interviewing a journalism school graduate for a job opening, a mouse ran over her foot and she screamed. After she left, Mr. Armstrong looked at me. The Brooklyn Zoning Board was meeting that afternoon, and he had no one to cover it. "If you start calling me Mike instead of Mr. Armstrong," he said, "you can have the job." I had just turned 18. I quit my job at the hamburger joint the next day and became a full-time reporter at the Phoenix. I'd never been happier in my life. I worked 90-hour weeks. My telephone rang constantly. I was always hurrying off to get interviews and checking the $10 Rolex I bought in the street to make sure I wasn't running late, rushing back to file my copy and staying up until 4 a.m. to set type when the typesetter quit. And I was bringing home $125 a week, if the check cleared. I wrote Brian long letters describing the sweet life in New York City. He wrote back saying things in Welch were still going downhill. Dad was drunk pretty much all the time, except when he was in jail. Mom had completely withdrawn into her own world, and Maureen was more or less living with neighbors. The ceiling in the bedroom had collapsed, and Brian had moved his bed onto the porch. He made walls by nailing boards along the railings, but it leaked pretty badly out there. So he slept under the inflatable raft. I told Lori that Brian should come live with us in New York, and she agreed. but I was afraid Brian would want to stay in Welch. He seemed more of a country boy than a city kid. He was always wandering through the woods, tinkering with discarded two-stroke engines, chopping wood or carving a block of wood into an animal head. He never complained about Welch, and unlike Lori and me, he'd made a lot of friends there. But I thought it was in Brian's long-term interest to get out of town. I made a list of reasons he should move to New York so I could argue him into it. I called him at Grandpa's and presented my case. He'd need to get a job to pay his share of the rent and groceries, I said, but jobs were going begging in the city. He could share the living room with me. There was plenty of space for a second bed. The toilet flushed and the ceiling never leaked. When I finished, Brian was silent for a moment. Then he said, "When's the soonest I can come?" Just like me, Brian hopped the trailways, but the morning after completing his junior year. The day after he got to New York, he found a job in an ice cream parlor in Brooklyn, not far from the Phoenix. He said he liked Brooklyn better than Manhattan or the Bronx, but he also developed a habit of dropping the Phoenix whenever he got to work and waiting for me until 3 or 4 in the morning so we could take the subway together up to the South Bronx. He never said anything, but I think he figured that when we were kids, we both stood a better chance if we took on the world together. I now saw no point in going to college. It was expensive, and my aim in going would have been to get a degree to qualify me for a job as a journalist. But now I had my job at the Phoenix. As for learning itself, I figured you didn't need a college degree to become one of those people who know what was really going on. If you paid attention, you could pick things up on your own. And so I overheard mention of something I was ignorant about, keeping kosher, Tammany Hall, haute couture. I researched it later on. One day, I interviewed a community activist who described a particular job program as a throwback to the progressive era. I had no idea what the progressive era was, and back in the office, I got in the World Book Encyclopedia. Mike Armstrong wanted to know what I was doing, and when I explained, he asked me if I had ever thought of going to college. "Why should I give up this job to go to college?" I said. "You've got college graduates working here who are doing what I'm doing." "You may not believe this," he said, "but there are better jobs out there than the one you've got now. You might get one of those jobs one of these days, but not without a college degree." Mike promised me that if I went to college, I could come back to the Phoenix anytime I wanted, but he added, he didn't think that I would. Lori's friends told me that Columbia University was the best in New York City. Since it took only men at the time, I applied to its sister college, Barnard, and was accepted. I received grants and loans to cover most of the tuition, which was steep, and I'd saved a little money while working at the Phoenix, but to pay for the rest, I had to spend a year answering phones at a Wall Street firm. Once school started, I could no longer pay my share of the rent, but a psychologist let me have a room in the Upper West Side of the apartment in exchange for looking after her 2 small sons. I found a weekend job in an art gallery, crowded all my classes into 2 days, and became the news editor of the Barnard Bulletin. But I gave that up when I was hired as an editorial assistant 3 days a week at one of the biggest magazines in the city. Writers there had published books and covered wars and interviewed presidents. I got to forward their mail, check their expense accounts, and do word counts on their manuscripts. I felt like I'd arrived. Mom and Dad called us now and then from Grandpa's to bring us up to date on life in Welch. I began to dread these calls, since every time I heard from them there was a new problem. A mudslide had washed away what was left of the stairs. Our neighbors, the Freemans, were trying to get the house condemned. Maureen had fallen off the porch and gashed her head. When Lori heard that, she declared it was time for Maureen to move to New York too. But Maureen was only 12, and I worried that she might be too young to leave home. She'd been 4 when we moved to West Virginia, and it was really all she knew. "Who's going to look after her?" I asked. "I will," Lori said. "She can stay with me." Lori called Maureen, who got squealy with excitement about the idea, and then Lori talked to Mom and Dad. Mom thought it was a great plan, but Dad accused Lori of stealing all his children and declared he was disowning her. Maureen arrived in early winter. By then, Brian had moved into a walk-up near Port Authority bus terminal and was using his address. Using his address, we enrolled Maureen in a good public school in Manhattan. On weekends, we all met at Lori's apartment. We made fried pork chops on heaping plates of spaghetti and meatballs and sat around talking about Welch, laughing so hard at the idea of all this craziness that our eyes had witnessed. One morning, 3 years after I moved to New York, I was getting ready for class and listening to the radio. The announcer reported a terrible traffic jam in the New Jersey Turnpike. A van had broken down, spilling clothes and furniture all over the road and creating a big backup. The police were trying to clear the highway, but a dog had jumped out of the van and was running up and down the turnpike as a couple of officers chased him. The announcer got lots of mileage out of the story, going on and on about the Rubes with their clunker of vehicles and a yapping dog who were making thousands of New York commuters late for work. That night, the psychologist told me I had a phone call. Jeanettikins, it was Mom. Guess what? She asked in a voice brimming with excitement. Your daddy and I have moved to New York. The first thing I thought about was the van that had broken down on the turnpike that morning. When I asked Mom about it, she admitted that yes, she and Dad had a teensy bit of technical difficulty with the van. It had popped a belt on some big crowded highway, and Tinkle, who was sick and tired of being cooped up, you know how that goes, had gotten loose. The police had shown up, and Dad got into an argument with them, and they threatened to arrest him, and gosh, it was quite the drama. How did you know? She asked. It was on the radio. On the radio? Mom asked. She couldn't believe it. With everything going on in the world these days, an old man popping a belt's news? But there was genuine glee in her voice. We only just got here, and we're already famous. After talking to Mom, I looked around my room. It was the maid's room off the kitchen, and it was tiny, with one narrow window and a bathroom that doubled as a closet. But it was mine. I had a room now. I had a life, too, and there was no place in either one for Mom and Dad. Still, the next day, I went to Lori's apartment to see them. Everyone was there. Mom and Dad hugged me. Dad pulled a pint of whiskey out of a paper bag while Mom described their various adventures on the trip. They had gone sightseeing earlier that day and taken their first ride on the subway, which Dad called a goddamn hole in the ground. Mom said Art Deco murals at the Rockefeller Center were kind of disappointing, not nearly as good as some of her own paintings. None of us kids were doing much to help carry the conversation. So, what's the plan? Brian finally asked. You're moving here. We have moved, Mom said. For good? I asked. That's right, Dad said. Why? I asked. The question came out sharply. Dad looked puzzled, as if the answer should have been obvious. So we could be a family again. He raised his pint. To the family, he said. Mom and Dad found a room in a boarding house a few blocks from Lori's apartment. The steely-haired landlady helped them move in, and a couple of months later, when they fell behind on their rent, she put their belongings on the street and padlocked their room. Mom and Dad moved into a 6-story flop house in a more dilapidated neighborhood. They lasted there a few months, but when Dad set their room on fire by falling asleep with a burning cigarette in his hand, they got kicked out. Brian believed that Mom and Dad needed to be forced to be self-sufficient or they'd be dependent on us forever, so he refused to take them in. But Lori had moved out of the South Bronx and into an apartment in the same building as Brian, and she let them come stay with her and Maureen. It would be for just a week or two, Mom and Dad assured her. A month, the most, while they got the kitty together and looked for a new place. 1 month at Lori's became 2 months, and then 3, and then 4. Each time I visited, the apartment was more jam-packed. Mom hung paintings on the walls and stacked street vines in the living room and put colored bottles in the windows for that stained glass effect. The stacks reached the ceilings, and then the living room filled up, and Mom's collectibles and found art overflowed into the kitchen. But it was Dad who was really getting to Lori. While he hadn't found steady work, he always had a mysterious way of hustling up pocket money, and he'd come home at night drunk, gunning for an argument. Brian saw that Lori was on the verge of snapping, so he invited Dad to come live with him. He put a lock on the booze cabinet, but Dad had been there under a week when Brian came home and found that Dad had used a screwdriver to take the door off its hinges, and then guzzled down every single bottle. Brian didn't lose his temper. He told Dad he had made a mistake by leaving liquor in the apartment. He said he had allowed Dad to stay, but Dad had to follow some rules, the first being that he had to stop drinking as long as he was there. You're the king of your own castle, and that's the way it should be, Dad replied, but it'll be a chilly day in hell before I bow to my own son. He and Mom still had the white van, they'd driven up from West Virginia, and he just started sleeping in that. Lori, meanwhile, had given Mom a deadline to clean out the apartment, but the deadline came and went, and so did a second and a third. Also, Dad was always dropping by to visit Mom, but then they got into such a screeching argument that neighbors banged on the walls. Dad started fighting with them, too. I can't take this anymore, Lori told me one day. Maybe you're just going to have to kick Mom out. But she's my mother. It doesn't matter. She's driving you crazy. Lori finally agreed. It almost killed her to tell Mom that she would have to leave, and she offered to do whatever it took to help her get reestablished, but Mom insisted she'd be fine. Lori's doing the right thing, she said to me. Sometimes you need a little crisis to get your adrenaline flowing and help you realize your potential. Mom and Tinkle moved into the van with Dad, and they lived there for a few months. But one day, they left it in the no parking zone, and the van was towed. Because it was unregistered, they couldn't get it back, and that night they slept on a park bench. They were homeless. All right, so I'm going to stop there.